Hello and welcome to Fight News Now. I'm John Pollock. Coming up over the next hour, we will be taking a further look at the UFC's card in Holland this Sunday with features on Stefan Struve and the returning Germaine de Randamie. And I'm going to be chatting with John Ramdien about a slew of fights that are in the works for the UFC coming up in the month of July. So sit back and check it out. It is Fight News Now coming your way. Joined here by John Ramdien. Mr. Ramdien, we are already looking ahead of UFC 200, the card that is 2 months away. Well, now we're going to look 3 months ahead because 201's got to take form. It looks like it's going to be July 30th in Atlanta, Georgia at the Phillips Arena. And the tentative main event, we state tentative, it's not 100% official yet, but looking in the direction of Robbie Lawler, Tyron Woodley. Do you like this fight at 170 pounds?
I mean, I do because I think they've been teasing this fight for so long. You look at Tyron Woodley, you look at some of his victories, you know what he's capable of.
Won over Carlos Condit.
Exactly. So, and on top of that, he's changed training camps, just trying to get different looks and trying to improve as a martial artist. And we've heard great things out of the Rufus Sport camp. So Tyron Woodley, an excellent challenge for Robbie Lawler. However, it's Robbie Lawler. He seems to be on a different level right now at 170 pounds. But I think it'll draw out the best in Robbie Lawler.
Yeah, and I mentioned Carlos Condit because that would have been the next pick if it wasn't Tyron Woodley. And you can look back to that fight in 2014 where Condit suffered that devastating knee injury at the hands of Tyron Woodley. And Woodley, it's been a while though, John, since we've seen him. It was January of last year when he beat Kelvin Gastelum. The Johnny Hendricks fight fell apart that week through no fault of Tyron Woodley's. You can certainly look, this guy is the most deserving, but I think a lot of people also, they were kind of angling for that rematch because it was so close with Robbie Lawler and Carlos Condit. You could have made a big argument for that one too.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if that fight came to fruition, if we saw that again, because you're looking at trying to make the biggest fights that you can, and we all, because we're kind of in a bubble here at Fight Network, we recognize who Tyron Woodley is. We understand that he's a serious talent. He'd be a good test for Robbie Lawler, a fresh test for Robbie Lawler. But again, that kind of story tells it all, where both guys were leaning on the cage. The fight was so close, it was entertaining, and some people believe that Carlos Condit should have won that fight. I think a lot of people are anticipating the rematch, and it might be the biggest fight that you could make right now, but maybe not. I think it also depends on what happens with Stephen Thompson and Rory McDonald. If Stephen Thompson comes out and obliterates Rory McDonald, which I don't think anybody expects, but I don't think anybody expected him to run through Johnny Hendricks the way that he did. So I think it depends on the outcome of what happens in that main event in Ottawa as well.
Some other fights that the UFC is working on, we look at their next Fox card, which will be in Chicago on July the 23rd. The main event they are working towards is a light heavyweight bout that Glover Teixeira threw out as a possibility with Anthony Johnson. It's a fight that you can certainly say makes a whole lot of sense at 205 pounds. That's a great fight if they can put it together. And that is essentially what we've seen these Fox cards. They are not going to give away pay-per-view headliners, but it is those kind of eliminator bouts, the last step before a fighter is going to be ready for a title shot, and that would qualify Johnson and Teixeira.
I agree, and it's you're also telling the story of the 205-pound picture. We all understand John Jones, Daniel Cormier, they're going to rematch at UFC 200. Well, you have to look at, what happens for the winner of that fight? Who's next in line? I know a lot of people, if it's John Jones, maybe even if it's Daniel Cormier, Alexander Gustafsson, that's one individual that's like, okay, well, the fight with John Jones was so close, not as much with Cormier, but it was an entertaining and outstanding fight. But I think it's Anthony Johnson that a lot of people want to see face off with John Jones, and he'll have that opportunity. Again, I also like the way that Glover Teixeira matches up with Daniel Cormier as well. So right now, 205 pounds, kind of developing. But when you look at the top of the division, it's essentially, 5 guys. You have John Jones, Cormier, Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, and Anthony Johnson, and then there's a big gap.
Yeah, and you can look at all the different possibilities. I think many people, I think they want to see that eventual John Jones-Anthony Johnson fight. But if those outcomes don't occur, if Cormier wins, that could throw a whole curveball into things involving John Jones. If Glover Teixeira wins, that could be, that could throw another curveball into things. So it's hardly just stack them together and you get that matchup at the end of things. I mean, John Jones, if Anthony Johnson were to lose that fight, and John Jones gets through, I mean, you're looking at a long set of rematches for John Jones, or potentially that's his exit from the light heavyweight division. I mean, these are just all these different factors that you can only look at, and the fights have to play themselves out.
And that's exactly what it is. It's what happens in that fight, because if Daniel Cormier, now a very motivated Daniel Cormier, he knows what it's like to be in there with John Jones. He gets to make the adjustments. He's in that room with Luke Rockhold, who's getting ready for his rematch with Chris Weidman. And you know that he knows, Luke Rockhold understands, and the team understands that Chris Weidman is coming for him. On top of that, Cain Velasquez getting ready for Travis Brown, and of course the goal is to become the heavyweight champion again. So all the stuff that's going on at that AKA gym in San Jose, you know Cormier's going to be motivated, and I would not be surprised. I mean, we all know that John Jones is the pound-for-pound best, or the number 2 pound-for-pound best, but you could understand how Daniel Cormier could edge out John Jones because of the first fight. It wasn't as if John Jones manhandled him. Yes, he won the fight, but if Daniel Cormier makes the adjustments, you could see how he would be able to defeat John Jones, and then you'd have to have a third fight between John Jones and Daniel Cormier, and then, of course, the winner of Glover Teixeira and Anthony Johnson be sitting on the sidelines.
All right. That light heavyweight fight makes a whole lot of sense. We go to the women's bantamweight division. You have Holly Holm and Valentina Shevchenko that they are working towards. I just find it very hard to see Holly Holm in a position here where she's going to be fighting just weeks after this Amanda Nunes fight. I think that Tate and Holm, with everything that happened with Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, you can easily make the argument that was the fight to put at UFC 200. Instead, Holly Holm takes a fight that all fights are going to present risks towards it, and you weigh that versus the upside here. And it's Holly Holm fighting on Fox, but this, to me, is hardly a fight that I think anyone anticipated Holly Holm having next.
Sure, but I mean, Holly Holm, she's ready. This girl will face anybody at 135 pounds. She's not going to shy away from any challenger. She understands that she needs to get her time in there. She needs to get her reps. And this is just another challenge, like whether she's fighting Shevchenko now or down the road. The pool at 135 pounds is pretty deep right now, and eventually she's going to face off with one of these girls. So I think it makes sense, get this under her belt, and she'll be challenging for the title again. I mean, the story writes itself.
I want to get some odds from Gabe Morency of what are the odds we get Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko before the end of the year for the title.
You never know. And a lot of people are counting out Amanda Nunes. That seems like a very motivated girl, and you've watched her progression as well. And her aggression, when she turns it on, she can hurt the best at 135 pounds. And again, I think we're going to see a different performance from Amanda Nunes. I think over her last number of fights, you've seen how much she has improved. But I think, in the spotlight, I have a feeling she's going to do very, very well.
It just seems to me that, as promoters, you make the fights that are going to do the most amount of business. And you have a women's division that, when you take the combination of Miesha Tate, Holly Holm, and Ronda Rousey, there is a ton of money to be made there involving those fights, and preferably with a championship involved. And it just appears that they are risking a whole lot of that with some of these fights they're making.
Sure, but what happens if Amanda Nunes becomes the champion too? Because, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, Ronda was unstoppable. You fast forward a year and a half or 2 years later, and the title has changed hands 3 or 4 times. Now I think it kind of opens up the entire division for people to say, okay, at least there's a new story. There's something I can attach myself to. Who will be the champion in 2 months? Will Ronda be able to come back to the sport and prove that she is the dominant force that everybody said that she was during her reign? So
one fight that we do know over the past day that has been confirmed is the return of Gilbert Melendez after his drug suspension, after the Eddie Alvarez loss. He now will step in against Edson Barbosa, who we may have just seen the best performance of his career against Anthony Pettis. This will be a very tough fight for Gilbert Melendez, but an excellent one to make. And I like it being on Fox. This is a big fight at 155 pounds.
Yeah, and I'm only joking. I love Gilbert Melendez. We've essentially showcased his career here on Fight Network. We understand what type of individual he is. He's a grinder. He's a guy that can push through the fire. When you watch Gilbert Melendez, it feels like you're not watching a natural athlete. It's a guy that has had to work hard for everything. And because of that, he understands how to embrace the grind. And that's kind of what I expect in this fight with Edson Barboza that there are so many deficiencies because of the athleticism and the explosiveness of Barboza, but it feels that Gilbert Melendez is one of the guys that can get through that and impose his will and find a way to win. And that's one of my favorite things about watching Gilbert Melendez. But again, all you have to do is look at this highlight reel of Edson Barboza. Even when he loses fights, he looks spectacular. You know, the fight with Tony Ferguson, we were there in Vegas. And yeah, he was controlling Ferguson. We understand how Ferguson is. Once he has an opportunity, he capitalizes, he gets the submission victory. That's what happens when we were talking about how deep 155 pounds is. From number 20 to number 1, it's just a murderer's row, really.
And you look at Gilbert Melendez, who's been very quiet over the past year. You haven't heard a whole lot from him. And the way his career could have gone, you remember that card with Eddie Alvarez was UFC 188. That was 3 weeks before the whole new USADA ramifications came into effect. So, I mean, you never look for a drug test failure, but if you were going to fail one, better to have happened at that time than 3 weeks later, and he would have been facing a much stiffer suspension, and something where you're certainly looking at your career options when you're looking at beyond a year of being away.
Yeah, I believe that Gilbert Melendez is one of these guys that's like, holy cow, let's make sure everything is on the up and up moving forward, because he's a family man, and he's one of these guys that, you know, is, as much as you don't think that he's a pioneer, you just look at his history, look at all of the shows that he's been a part of, whether it's been Shudo or Rumble on the Rock out at BJ Penn's organization, TJ Thompson's organization. He's been a part of that. He was Strikeforce champion. So I think that there's a lot of hardcore fans out there that would love to see Gilbert Melendez become a UFC champion. And I think he has what it takes to be a champion. He just has to make sure his T's are crossed and his I's are dotted. And I think with the drug failure, he's not going to make that mistake again.
All right. There's action coming up this weekend from the UFC in Rotterdam in Holland, and the prelims will be airing here in Canada on Fight Network starting off at noon Eastern time, with 4 fights airing here on Fight Network, including Rustam Khabilov taking on Chris Wade in the lightweight division.